think we'll get started. If anybody joins us later, I know there's some people that are still traveling and just, it's this time of year. So we're missing a few people that have been here regularly, but they might watch online or watch it later. So I think we'll get started. Before I pass this around this week, I just wanted to ask you that I have some resources that I didn't put on the original resource list. Just because some of them I forgot, and a couple of podcasts, things like that you might be interested, especially after today's topic. So I'm going to email those out to anybody who's interested. So when you put your name and your email, if you want to get those resources in your email, just put an asterisk by your name, because I don't want to bomb your email boxes if you don't want that. I know, I'll just get them to you, okay? Because I know you've been reading up on things, so I will get them. I know you have. So I will get you the information. And then if you happen to be online and you're not here tonight, and I knew that, I will also be sending them to you. And I'll bring this down. All right, well, let's get started tonight. I wanted to thank everybody for coming, for returning back. I think that all of us, me included, really have been learning a lot and making us think about things that maybe was in the back of our mind or maybe not at all, and at least starting to think about it. And like I said, we only have 5 hours to spend together on a topic that we could probably spend a few years trying to figure out. Still practicing my Cherokee, but maybe by the last class, I'll be able to greet you that way. I'm still working on it. All right, I have to remember I'm supposed to point at Jonah to get to the next slide. So as we've done each week, to read our acknowledgement of the land that we're standing on tonight and sitting on. Tonight we are gathered on the traditional homeland of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa people. They were stewards of the land long before Arlington Heights was settled by European immigrants. And Laura, you have not been here, but this was actually a piece of a land acknowledgement done by Our Savior's Lutheran Church on North Arlington Heights Road. And I worked some with them, so they were gracious to let me use part of this for tonight. Kim. That's all right.
This class has made me think about Thanksgiving, but differently. So I think that might be part of our Thanksgiving from here on in.
Nice. I like that a lot. Well, I already welcome, but does anybody have any questions from the past weeks or something that you read? We're going to talk about something I know that Jerry saw in the Tribune this week, and she brought the copy for me, so we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Any other questions or something you read that you went, what? That's not exactly what we talked about, or something that just struck you? Hal? It is. So Killers of the Flower Moon. How many people have seen that movie now?
Not yet. No.
Quite a few. If you haven't seen it, I know it's long. But honestly, when I was in the theater watching it, I didn't really feel like I was there for 3.5 hours. But it really has to do with some that we have talked about the land a little bit, but next week talking more about natural resources and the U.S. government and their role in trying to acquire that and still trying to, who owns the actual land, who owns the subland, all of those kinds of things. Of course, it's a Martin Scorsese movie, but I found that in doing some research after I saw the movie, that it was accurate. I felt like it was an accurate portrayal. He worked a lot with the tribe when he was doing the movie. Of course, it's a movie, and it's Hollywood and all those kinds of things. But I think that two things it did. I think, first of all, it was fairly accurate, and second of all, if it's something that you've never thought about before, it will make you think and go and try and find out more.
And it's Leonardo DiCaprio.
And Leonardo DiCaprio, right.
From Titanic.
Jane? And the book, yeah. So I am actually a huge reader, but I had not read that book before I saw the movie. But I got the book, so I'm going to start reading it as soon as I have time.
It's an eye-opener.
Yes. Laura? Or Cindy, sorry.
There's a show, Reservation Dogs.
Yes.
Watch that.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody else seen that show, Reservation Dogs?
What's it on?
Hulu. Yeah, it's on Hulu. And then the other one I suggested was Basketball or Nothing.
Oh, I watched that with Ian, my youngest son, yeah.
That's on Netflix. But if you liked Reservation Dogs, you should watch Basketball or Nothing. I think you would like it.
Basketball or Nothing. Basketball or Nothing. It's a documentary.
Anybody else? Anybody else? I'm going to move this up because I see Betty saying she can't hear me.
No, I can hear you.
Oh, other people. Sorry. If we get into a big discussion, I'll pass the microphone. Which I think, Jonah, can I turn the microphone on for this? They're already on. Okay. I'm going to use this for this part. I was wondering, last week we talked a little about Thanksgiving, and so I was wondering, Kim already shared something she did, but I was wondering if anybody did anything different this year or special for Thanksgiving based on some of the things we talked about in the last couple weeks.
I told my family, my aunts, that we're studying about Native Americans, and they were interested in it. And they did not eat turkey, and they did not have pumpkin pie. Yes.
That is correct.
Yes.
Yes, they did not.
Anybody else? We could pass back to Kim and Susan.
Yeah. Well, I decided to go a little bit whole hog this year, half hog maybe. So in addition to the land acknowledgement, my sister and I together put our heads together and we made some indigenous dishes for our sides, like a wild rice salad. That's a Potawatomi recipe. Baked acorn squash. Three Sisters succotash, which is a classic across many tribes, indigenous dish. So that was a little bit different for us too.
I like that.
Well, part of our Thanksgiving time was spending time with some Native family members. My brother married a woman who's half Yaqui, from the Yaqui tribe in the Southwest. And one of her boys, one of the nephews, is really coming to terms with being mixed race. He's beginning to realize that he's kind of been masquerading as something he isn't, and so he wants to know more about what that means to him. Also, I got to spend time with a friend who adopted a child. She's a white woman, family friend, adopted a child from the Leech Lake Reservation where my dad grew up. And because the natives are sovereign, they both had to lawyer up. The elders had to approve the adoption. It went through. She made a number of promises to the tribe. I will not cut his hair. I will bring back the placenta from his birth for a certain ceremony that they do. I will teach him Ojibwe. She has him in a preschool where they have 3 hours a day. So I felt like, although the things we ate at our son's sister-in-law's home were very American traditional, we did have a native flavor at the same time.
I think that sounds, and that is what Susan's talking about. The adoptions of Native children by white people is actually a big issue right now. It's been in the Supreme Court. So that's really, that she was able to make those
The woman chose
pledges
Catherine.
with the
She chose our friend based on what she'd
sure.
heard about the fact that Catherine is an activist.
Mm-hmm.
Catherine is a white gal who goes to a Spanish-speaking church and is an advocate for immigrants. And this woman said, you know what, I think you've got the right spirit to have my
That's
child.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I wondered if you could explain
The placenta. Yeah, they do a ceremony near a tree. I don't know anything about it. But she kept all the promises that she'd made to the tribe, and she intends to continue to keep them. Yeah.
Anybody else? Oh, Ken? Or no? All right. Well, then let's move on. All right. Yes. So just a reminder, or for anybody who's new, the doctrine of discovery is a theological, philosophical, and legal framework that dates all the way back to the 15th century that gave Christian governments moral and legal right to invade and seize indigenous lands and dominate indigenous peoples. And this is a direct quote where I thought it simplified, it made it so concise for us, by Sarah Augustine, who wrote the book, The Land is Not Empty. I got that right this week. And that just is our framework for everything that we're talking about during these weeks. And then just a review of why it's important for us as a faith community, talking about the PCUSA and their repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, along with many other denominations. We are definitely not the only one. The Pope has apologized and repudiated the Methodist Church, Episcopalians, Quaker, many denominations and faith communities are working through these issues. And as a community of faith, we're always called to take steps to right the wrongs that we learn about. So I wanted to just review a little bit about the things that we've talked about in the last 2 weeks to kind of set where we are. But as the U.S. boarding school became kind of U.S. policy, so we're going to be talking a lot about boarding schools tonight. How many people feel like they're a little bit familiar with that topic? Quite a few, good. So the Indian Removal Act that we talked about 2 weeks ago really moved many Native Americans away from their homelands and away from their homes and to many places west of the Mississippi, but not everyone. Some were just either made their areas were made smaller, but they were many were moved far away. We talked about the Trail of Tears. We talked about the Long Walk. We talked about the Black Hawk War, the Sioux Nation and their travels through Minnesota and the Dakotas. In 1887, we didn't talk about last week, but the Dawes Act, and it's a lot to go into, but basically the Dawes Act is where land started to be split up. Prior to that, Native Americans really saw the land, they were just part of the land. They didn't own the land, they were part of it. And so the idea of ownership was foreign to them. But as the settlers came in the U.S. government, they passed an act that basically said that you could own a piece of land. And so they started what they called allotment of land. And any of that land that wasn't allotted to Native Americans then was open for settlers to come in. So when you hear things about land grabs, land rushes, all of those things that you see in the movies, and that's what that is, as a part of the Dawes Act. So as a personal example, that is then how some tribes, how you can actually then be eligible for citizenship if the government sees that you owned land. So my great-grandmother was allotted land through the Dawes Act in Oklahoma. And so because of that, anybody who's on those rolls, then you're eligible for citizenship in that tribe. That's not for every tribe. Some tribes are different. But that for the Cherokee tribe, the Dawes Act is how they decide. As the railroad expanded and people could get west, they were moving people out if the land wasn't allotted to people. So suddenly these reservations are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. More Christian white people are moving in on the Native Americans. And then, of course, we know the discovery of natural resources. So things, ore, gold, oil. So as we see in Killers of the Flower Moon, the finding of oil was huge, especially in Oklahoma. And out west in those areas in the Navajo Nation and some of the Pueblo areas, uranium. If those of you who've seen the movie Oppenheimer, you will see what happened there. All the same idea. So those were the things that were going on at the time. Any questions on that? Okay. So really, even before the boarding schools became policy in the United States, missionaries, especially in the Southwest, and the Puritans who were landing in the Northeast, were operating boarding schools for indigenous children as early as the 1600s, and in the Southwest even before that. So Catholic missionaries who were coming up through Mexico into New Mexico, Arizona, California, were opening schools. And really their sole purpose was to convert the children to Christianity and assimilate them into a Christian culture. And that started much before all of the U.S. government started their policies that really caused quite a bit of trauma in the Native American community. Oh, wait. Can you stop it for a second? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to show you a short video before we talk. It's I think it's 5 or 6 minutes, but I think it's a very concise history of the boarding school issue, and then we'll talk some about it a little more in depth. But we're going to watch this video first. And it should work.
Tonight, a lost history many are just now beginning to hear about. The discovery of 215 children's bodies in a mass grave at an Indigenous boarding school in Canada this past summer sparked a reckoning with such schools here in the U.S. And as Chris Harapsky reports, that reckoning is reaching Minnesota.
This way you're growing vocabulary.
At the University of Minnesota Morris, Professor Gabriel DeRosier is teaching Anishinaabe-Moan, the native language of the Ojibwe people.
It was important back in traditional times to know these things.
It does not escape him that 120 years ago, on the very soil he's standing on, speaking this language was forbidden, even punished.
Cultural genocide.
He's talking about an era of Indian boarding schools, and he would know. His mother, his uncles attended them. DeRosier himself went to a Catholic day school outside his reservation in Canada, the effects of which produce childhood trauma and a broken family structure that is difficult to grasp.
She didn't really know how to express or love. And that all came from what she experienced as a child, you know. All her brothers became alcoholics, and they all died alcoholics, and tragic deaths. So.
For 100 years, dating back to the 1860s, Native American boarding schools existed in the United States. By historical accounts, they were funded by the federal government, meant to sever American Indian culture and quote-unquote civilize the Indian.
My family has 2 generations of boarding school history that I know of.
Christine Dindisi McCleve is the CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition based in Minneapolis. She explains how President Ulysses Grant gave federal money to churches at first to start these schools.
Because he figured that they would not be corrupt with those funds. And so that is what opened the door to federally funded, church-run Indian boarding schools.
In 1879, U.S. Army Captain Richard Henry Pratt established the first federally funded off-reservation Indian school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, enrolling more than 10,000 American Indian and Alaskan Native children from more than 140 tribes. Pratt famously once said,
"They must get into the swim of American citizenship, kill the Indian in him, and save the man."
But he also created propaganda. He took before and after photos of these students to prove that his experiment worked and that the Indians could be quote-unquote civilized.
That school became a model for 16 schools in the state of Minnesota, from Pipestone to Morris to Vermilion, and at least 367 schools across the U.S., according to the Healing Coalition. Problem is, no one, not even the federal government, knows exactly how many schools there were, nor exactly how many children attended them. There is no official record. But according to the book Education for Extinction, the best estimate is that by 1926, 83% of Indian school-aged children attended boarding schools, ultimately reaching an estimated 200,000 American Indian children, according to McCleve.
There were laws that were written that said that all Indian children had to attend these boarding schools in the beginning years. If a parent chose not to let their kid go or tried to prevent them from being taken, they could be thrown in jail, and some were, or they could have rations withheld. And so they had no choice. Their children were forcibly taken.
She says conditions were often brutal.
They were given uniforms, they were given a number, they were referred to by their number only. And their hair was cut, which for many tribes across Turtle Island represents either grief or shame.
I think it depends on the era and it depends on the school.
Dr. Kate Bean is an American Indian Studies professor at the University of Minnesota and director of Native American Initiatives at the Minnesota Historical Society. While she calls much of this era ethnic cleansing, she points out that not every school was that harsh.
My grandmother went to the Flander Indian School in South Dakota, and she had a wonderful experience there, learning how to farm, learning how to sew. And her experiences there as a student were very, very starkly different than my grandfather's experiences at a different boarding school in South Dakota.
Each story is different, but the atrocities shared by so many are no longer going unnoticed.
And when I look out, I see that none of us have been spared.
In Minneapolis this September, a group gathered to honor and remember boarding school survivors.
I distinctly recall her saying to me directly, "If I don't put you in the boarding school, they're going to take you away from me."
A march is a voice.
Put your hands up!
But a secretary in the federal government? That is power.
We must shed light on the unspoken traumas of the past, no matter how hard it will be.
Former Congresswoman Deb Haaland is now the head of the Interior Department that ran many of these schools a century earlier. Her own family attended them. And for the first time in the U.S., the federal government is investigating records, stories, archives, and eventually ground-penetrating radar to find out how many children never made it home.
Acknowledgement is the very first step. Acknowledging that this history happened. Recognizing that this history happened. Recognizing the impact on this history is the next step.
All right. Any, excuse me, any questions or comments on that video? You're right, it was not right. Right. I just, this spring when I was on the Peace USA Travel Seminar, we met a number of people whose families had been impacted by the boarding schools and, you know, family trauma from generations. But one in particular that I recall was a man, I can't remember if we got lost or what happened, but we were about an hour and a half late for dinner. They waited for us all that time and had dinner waiting for us when we got to this church in Fort Defiance. But he told us a story about himself that when he was a child, his father, because it was required to go to the boarding schools, his father would hide him in the fields every day until he knew everybody was gone for the day who was looking for kids to take to the boarding schools. And then they would bring him back home, and so every day they would hide him out in the fields. Eventually he was caught and he did go to a boarding school, but it took a long time. But to listen to him tell stories of literally you didn't have an option, you know, where they say, well, they made laws where it was, you know, like we're required to go to kindergarten. It wasn't like, it was a law like you are going and we're taking you here and we're going to cut your hair and we're going to make you wear these clothes and you cannot speak your language. Much different than just a law. But really the point that we're talking about, these boarding schools, really started with the Indian Civilization Act Fund of 1819, and then President Grant's peace policy, which sounds pretty contradictory to, but what that peace policy was supposed to be saying is that the United States was going to find a way to kind of make nice with the Native Americans, to allow them to have some governance and those kinds of things. But in exchange for that, there were these boarding schools and all of those types of things. And they, because the nation, you know, the United States at the time was, the Christian churches were what was predominant in the areas, they involved the churches, and then that's where they started paying denominations. Sometimes we'll see in the next slide, per capita for kids to be in their schools. So I think I have the article down here, but the US government would offer, for example, about $107 per child to the Presbyterian Church to have children in their schools. And like they said in the video, and I did hear this from people on reservations, that not every boarding school was terrible, but the idea of it, I think, is what we're talking about. And there certainly were very horrible things that went on. So we heard about Captain Richard Henry Pratt in the video, and he really was, I would say, kind of the start of where these boarding schools really became something that we don't want them to be, where he was trying to Christianize the Native Americans, take away their religion, their language, everything. And he is famous for that kill the Indian and save the man, which really became the mentality in the United States in the late 1800s. Through the 1900s, this may sound like something that happened way back in the 1800s and maybe the early 1900s, but boarding schools really just have stopped being this type of boarding school in the 1970s and 80s. There still are schools, day schools, that are for Native Americans, run sometimes by churches, but certainly, I hope, are not what they were at this time. So in 1879, I think the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania is one that many of us now have heard about. How many people are a little bit familiar or have heard of the Carlisle School? Some. If you are more interested in it, I would encourage you to read about it. But it was the first government-funded school. So he was actually a Baptist, I believe, and started this school. He had run a prison and thought that the way he did that worked to, quote, fix people. And so he decided to try that with the Native American children. And so that's where it really started, where there was this assimilation, change your culture, those things. The schools were run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which still exists today, but they were in charge of these schools, so part of the United States government.
In the video,
Oh, sure.
you mentioned how many people were in the Carlisle school? 100,000?
I think 10,000, yes. I mean, we're talking thousands of children. When we were on the Navajo Nation, where the boarding schools really have caused tremendous amount of intergenerational trauma, the people there who are my age and a little bit older, they have a couple of 2-3 generations of people and family members who were just taken, in the middle of the day, in the morning, just taken to these schools and gone. And as we will hear it towards the end of tonight, never came back. And that's actually a huge thing that's going on right now, is trying to figure out what happened to everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit about how did it become that the federal government could give money to churches, because we certainly talk a lot about the separation of church and state, the separation of funds. How could it that the federal government could give money to the church for the schools? And in 1908, there was a Supreme Court decision that was handed down. It was called Quick Bear versus Loop. I actually visited the Loop Presbyterian Church in Arizona. Wonderful congregation, small but just wonderful. But this Supreme Court decision ruled that the federal government could use tribal treaty money and tribal trust fund money to pay for children to attend the boarding school. So kind of a little loophole, I think you could maybe call it, where then they could use that money that was being held in trust and pay the churches. So basically, although there were, like Carlisle, many of these boarding schools were run by churches. The Presbyterian Church, I believe, was second in line only to the Roman Catholic Church in the number of boarding schools that they operated. It upheld that spending federal funds on religious schools did not apply to Indian treaty funds. So basically that separation of church and state that we're always talking about, not just in this, but in everything, really didn't exist. And I think as we learn more about the founding of the United States and all of that, there was a lot of not separation of church and state. And this is particularly financially, there was not a separation. So like I said before, the government would offer per capita money for the number of kids. So then you could see why they were, churches, not only today, but then were probably needed money. Same story. Cindy?
It's why they wouldn't report someone had died. Because it's like, getting
Right.
Social Security check after they've gone.
Right.
You wouldn't want to keep records.
You wouldn't want to keep records. And how horrible do you look that kids are dying on your watch, but also financially. Any other questions or comments on that?
If it was $107 per student, I wonder what portion of that was actually spent per child.
Probably not a lot.
I'll bet.
Probably not a lot. I'm sure there was a lot of corruption and just all kinds of, we know there was a lot of abuse, but I would imagine monetarily corruption.
I feel sorry for that man who said all of his family had alcoholic problems.
Yes. Yep. Because it, passes on. Yes.
How are we making restitution to this? In Canada, a couple of years ago when all that came out, I got the feeling that they were doing something, digging up bodies. What are we doing here?
So when we get to the end of today, I'll show you a little bit of what we're doing, but we are behind Canada. Canada definitely is ahead of us in that they actually have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission going on, where there has been much more in the reparation area. And reparation doesn't necessarily mean that, oh my gosh, this church was built on land that was not really rightfully paid for. But what do you do to make that right? It doesn't necessarily mean that First Presbyterian Church of Arlington Heights is going to give this church back to the tribe that was here, but what can you do to make that right? And then as far as boarding schools is really finding out what boarding schools were there and what happened to the children that never came home. And we're going to, at the end of this, we'll talk a little bit about what the United States is trying to do now. It's a long road. Any other questions? That's a great question. Well, we talked about the federal government paid institutions per capita. They also provided land on the reservations to the churches and the missionaries to build their schools. We actually visited, well, in South Dakota, I believe I visited an area where there was a school, but at the time I didn't really understand that at all. Now I want to go back there and check it out. But in Arizona, there's a town called Ganado. And has anybody ever been there? Okay. So it is a town that was actually built on the Navajo reservation by Presbyterian missionaries. And we actually had a person on our trip. It took me like 3 days to figure out. She kept telling us that she was from Ganado, and like she was more pale than me and had blonde hair, and I'm like, I don't understand. Turned out her parents were missionaries in Ganado. She was having a very, very hard time as we were learning, and she kept saying, I don't know what to think. So the whole town was built. There was a hospital, a school, a church, and it was all in kind of this enclosed area, and there was one area where the Native Americans went to the hospital and school, and then there was another part of town where all the missionaries lived. When we went there, I was like, oh. Now they've done a lot of work now to change that, but you can imagine after years and years, there's still, missionaries have left these areas. The churches we talked about in the beginning, they don't have pastors, they don't have things like that. So, and I said the Presbyterian Church, the other thing that then happened, because they were giving money and it was all tied together, was that churches and religious bodies could make recommendations for people to be in the presidential cabinets and appointees. So, I'm not saying these things don't go on everywhere, but all of those things, all tied together. The Presbyterian Church is still working on determining the number of schools it operated. They really do have, there's a wonderful man whose name is Irv Porter, who really is working hard to bring this topic to the forefront of Presbyterian churches and get us to be talking about it. He is a wonderful speaker. Betty?
I was just scrolling through the number of boarding schools run by the Presbyterian Church. Almost none of them are still open.
Right.
I got down through M and I just couldn't keep going. I mean, the list was huge.
Yes. I mean, all of the, like I told you the first day, right now there's 95 Presbyterian Native American congregations. And you can imagine then just interspersed all around there were schools in all different areas, so a lot. Some, and I would imagine that some of them were fine, and some of them weren't. But the idea of taking children from their families, I'm not sure that's ever okay. And this is actually the picture from that video of the Carlisle school. So what would happen is, they had all dressed the same. They had their hair cut. They couldn't speak the language. If there's some podcasts out there you can listen to of survivors from boarding schools and, beaten. Corporal punishment was really not a thing among Native Americans. So spanking and those types of things, that was not a part of Native American culture until families, their children went away to boarding schools. And then what happens, even in one of our families, what happens if you were hit as a child, then when you become an adult, those things happen again. And so all of that just passes along. And so corporal punishment became a problem among the tribes in families, not because it was ever part of their culture before. So I know this is hard to see, but we saw this in the video. By 1926, nearly 83% of Indian school-age children were attending boarding schools. So one of the things that I think you might think about is, I told the story of my family the first week. You start to wonder, and I even wondered it, why did my grandma, never really talk? I mean, we knew she was Cherokee, we knew that, but it wasn't really part of our family. And when you think back on it, in these years when my grandma would have been growing up, now her mother died, who was Cherokee, when my grandmother was 3, so that was part of it, because many of her cousins still lived on the reservation. But the U.S. government was sending people to boarding schools and trying to have you not speak Cherokee or whatever other tribe you were. They did not want you to dress that way. And so then you're not passing it on to your family. There is a huge, among many tribes now, to revive languages, to revive culture. There's even organizations in the Chicago area that are working with people on that. And many of the reservations have language programs for children that are really trying to revive some of that was lost because of the U.S. policies on assimilation and all those types of things. Any questions about that? Comments? So yeah, 300, and I know, Betty, you said you saw even more now in the list. I think that this stat is a little bit old because they're still trying to figure out how many schools there were. Oh, so I want to just talk, when we've been talking about trauma, I think that's kind of a big word right now. We all hear about kind of individual trauma that you might experience because you had an event in your life that caused you trauma. a death in the family, a divorce in the family, things like that. Individual trauma. Many of us have heard of adverse childhood experiences, those types of things. But historical trauma is really a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over a lifetime and generation to generation. So these boarding schools were causing what they call historical trauma. And so it passes on from generation to generation, why we're seeing so many problems with alcoholism and poverty. And because people just are passing that on. Many tribes are doing a lot of work, and in the next 2 weeks, I know this is kind of a downer topic tonight, but in the next 2 weeks, we're really going to be talking about what are some of the tribes doing that are really hopeful work, and how could we be part of that, and what really could happen to move people forward. But that historical trauma has really caused a lot of loss of life, their land, their culture. And, think of ourselves if your culture just goes away. What happens? Cindy?
Like that's something that Preservation Dogs does a good job of, is
Yes.
connecting these 4 to 5 kids who are just searching. As a teenager, you search for who you are, but they're just floundering because they don't have, or they have to really push the adults to give them, share the culture that they're just desiring so much.
Right, because there just wasn't they're not able. It's not. I think that it's not necessarily that parents, grandparents don't want to, but they just, because of the trauma, they're not able to share. Any other comments on that? So this just talks a little bit about the intergenerational trauma. That's just a picture of the church in Loop, Arizona, in the town where the Supreme Court decision in 1908 was from. But the schools help create, we've talked about, generations of traumatized children who then grew into adults who maybe, hopefully, went back to their tribes, but they had all of this trauma. I mean, it happens in any, to many people. You have some trauma, it's not resolved. They didn't have the resources, and it was generational after generation trauma. So many people medicated with pain. They have a lot of drug and alcohol abuse issues on many of the reservations, and they're really working hard on many of them to address that. And then, rage, denial, it turns into all kinds of destructive behaviors. So I think that sometimes we talked about the first week, what do we think of when you think of Native Americans? And I think that many people, because maybe they don't know about all of this, and then they just have this view that's, not quite right of, why are people in these situations? This is, I know, a little bit small to read, but this just talks a little bit about what people lost. So as an individual, you might have lost your self-esteem, your sense of safety when you're in a boarding school, and just difficulty with relationships, because suddenly you're taken from, your family was not just your mother and father, brother or sister, but your family was your tribe. Your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, your extended family. I think even more so than we think of that as family. The land, the people were all connected. And so if you're removed from that, you've really lost all of that. They've lost their parents are not there anymore. They have lost their sense of community, like we talked about, and then their language. So suddenly they can't speak their language anymore. Could be severely punished for that. They lose their traditions. And then what does it do to the tribes? Suddenly, there aren't people to carry on those traditions anymore. That's why I said I think today there's really a push to revive a lot of that. And so you're starting to see more of it in the news. Maybe because you came to this class, you might notice it more in the news. But there just is more, I think, going on. This was just kind of what happened to start to change this. The Wheeler-Howard Act was in 1934. And what this did was start to decriminalize indigenous culture and religion. It did start to close some of the boarding schools because they still were requiring it, but they could practice a little bit more of their religion sometimes. It was not perfect, but it was a start to some of that. And controversial whether it was good or bad. You can read up more on it. But in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and that's what you might hear some in the Supreme Court right now, is a very active legislation that's been in the Supreme Court recently. And that's why I'm going to send you a podcast about that if you're interested in hearing more. But in the 1978, it was a federal law that governed jurisdiction over the removal of Indian children from their families. And it affected removing them to go to boarding schools, but also as far as foster parents, custody, adoption cases. So as Susan was talking about, adoption could happen, but some promises made to the tribe. It was not just a sure. Before that, most of the time, a Native American child would be removed and go to a white family with no, before this act. This is only 1978. I mean, I was just a freshman in high school, and these things were still going on. That to me, I think that's what sometimes surprises me, like, oh, it seems like, why would people act like that in my lifetime? But they did. And then it gives tribal governments jurisdiction over children who live on the reservation. So as Susan was talking about, then some promises made to that tribe because of that. Any questions about that? How many people have been hearing anything about that in the news? You might now that you heard it here, you might start to hear about it more. There is actually quite a bit going on with it. Some trying to overturn it, some trying to keep it, and has made it to the Supreme Court. So this is what Jerry asked about. So there is a federal boarding school initiative that was launched in June of 2022 by the U.S. Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland. She is the first Native American woman to be in the presidential cabinet. If you go online and watch her speak, we saw just a small clip of her. She is phenomenal. I did pass out the first week, and I still have a couple more copies of an article about her. Her grandparents were in a boarding school. She suffered greatly from alcoholism. If you read the story about her, incredible story as a single mom, going to college, getting her degree, being called by President Biden to come. She's actually from Laguna Pueblo, which we talked about the first weeks about the Pueblo Revolt and that area of the country in New Mexico. I actually worshiped on the Sunday I was there at the Laguna United Presbyterian Church. They are very proud of her. Talked about her quite a bit, and most of them know her. So that was, I didn't know a lot about her till then, but she led, it just, I think, ended, led a year-long tour of the United States where she listened to survivors. Well, that's the first start, is being able to hear people's stories and hear what they went through so that you can acknowledge that these things actually happened. I'm sure there's people out there who think it really wasn't that bad. But she spent a year traveling all through the United States. And now there is a movement to create a Truth and Healing Commission. And it's actually called the Truth and Healing Commission Indian Boarding School Policies Act. There is a version of it that has passed the Senate. but it has not, the version has not passed the House yet. And I have, if you're interested in reading more about that, I actually have flyers up here that will tell you more about that. We're going to keep talking about it in the next weeks, but it really is a first step in making some amends and righting the wrongs that the boarding schools really have caused. You know, among other, you know, just moving the Native Americans off their land caused plenty, but these boarding schools have really caused quite a bit of trauma. But the act would establish a federal commission that would conduct a full investigation into all the assimilation policies. It would try to find the location of children that have never come back to their reservations. I think that is huge. It would document ongoing impacts. It would locate church and government records. You can imagine, I think that the Presbyterian Church is trying to do the right thing, but hard to find records, and sometimes I'm sure there's churches that don't want to turn those over necessarily. But this act would help with that. It would hold public hearings. It would gather knowledge from subject matter experts. Everything would be shared publicly, and then a final report would be issued. I think it's a step forward. It was June of 2023 that the Senate bill passed through their version passed through the Senate, but there is a version in the House that has not passed. And it's something those of you who are interested, I'll keep you up to date on it as things happen. I'm hoping in the next year we can, you know, keep some of these discussions going, especially as the Presbyterian Church continues their discussions on these types of things. Any questions on that? Had anybody ever heard of that before? Yeah, good. Couple people. Oh, I'm not going to move to that yet. Okay, real quickly, I wanted, did anybody see the article, besides Jerry, in the Chicago Tribune this weekend? Was about the boarding school right here in Des Plaines that became Maryville, which I'm sure many of you know about. Maryville started out as a boarding school for Native American children. And you can go online and get it, but it's a whole page article written around Thanksgiving time about they were Sioux children moved from the Dakotas to, at the time it was called St. Mary's, and is now Maryville Academy, and all that comes with that. They have lots of good things going on there now, so I don't want to diss that place anymore, but it did. I do want people to be aware that it started off. I did not know that either. That was news to me. But just as it was news to me when I read the article about the sale of land in Arlington Heights to Asa Dunton. So that was a little bit of news to me too. Any questions? I know it's so quick to get through all of this in this amount of time. Could talk for a long time. Next week, our theme really is that we're all connected, and we're going to start talking about some current issues. We've been talking a lot of history, but we're going to talk about some Native American spirituality and how people who are active in some of our Native American churches combine their Native spirituality with being a Christian. We're going to talk a little bit about a huge topic on the reservations is missing murdered Indigenous women. If you've ever seen the movie Wind River, or you could watch it this week if you want to. We're going to talk a little about land and water rights. We've talked quite a bit about that already. And then land and artifact return. And that's a big topic in Illinois right now, is the return of Native American artifacts to the tribes. So those are our topics for next week. I do have some new articles up here that are about boarding schools, so if you're interested in any of those, please feel free. If you're new this week, I made a couple more copies of the Doctrine of Discovery documents. I have a copy of the Act, the Indian School Policies Act, that would start something like Canada has, along with the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation. It's also modeled after the commission that they had in South Africa at the time when apartheid was abolished. So those same types of things. I think kind of a different concept to people in the United States to do something like that, but might be needed. Any comments or questions? So as we've closed each week together reading our prayer blessing, may the warm winds of heaven blow softly upon your house. May the Great Spirit bless all who enter here. May your moccasins make happy tracks in many snows. And may the rainbow always touch your shoulder. For such a heavy topic, I think it's a nice ending. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you all giving time for this topic, and hope it's something that you'd like to continue talking about. This is Canyon de Chelly, if those of you who are wondering. That we talked about last week. This is in Arizona, near Chinle, Arizona. This is where the Navajo hid before they were captured as part of the Long Walk.